Hello and welcome to the THE webinar, Measuring What Matters, Rethinking Language Assessment for a Changing World. This webinar is held in partnership with Oxford University Press. I am Sridhu, Deputy Editor for Branded Content at THE. As the needs of learners and institutions change with the changing world, English language assessment also need to evolve to reflect real-life language use. A few weeks ago, we published a white paper on this topic, bringing together insights from higher education experts across the world, some of whom are joining us on the panel today. So the main theme for today's discussion is this. As learners navigate an academic journey that is more and more digitalized, collaborative, and influenced by AI, is traditional language assessment lagging behind? Before we begin, I would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded. We will share an on-demand video and a summary article with all the participants after the webinar. We will also be taking questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A function to post any questions you would like to ask the panel. I will now invite the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Hanan, would you mind going first?
Sure. My name is Hanan Khalifa. I would like to introduce myself as a language tester, an impact evaluator, and an education reform expert. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. Michael, could I come to you next?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Vogel. I am Director of International Admissions at the University of New Mexico, and I spend all my day, all my time just helping students from all over the world get the best possible education they have.
Thank you. Hannah, would you mind going next, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Jones. I'm Director of English Language Education at the University of Edinburgh. So my remit is strategic oversight of all of the English for academic purposes provision for the university. So things like pre-sessional English for applicants that have not yet met the English language conditions of their offer, as well as a really large in-sessional English language provision for all of the university's students. I am also chair of BALEAP. For those of you who don't know, that is the British Association of Lecturers in English for Academic Purposes. I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you. And finally, Tony.
Hi, my name's Tony Green. I'm Director of Research at Oxford University Press ELT and responsible for the Oxford Test of English. So coming at this from the test provider's perspective.
Thank you all. Before we go into the main discussion, I will hand over to Tony for a brief presentation to tell us more about the key findings from OUP's recent research on English language testing. Over to you, Tony.
Okay, thanks so much. So I thought it would be helpful to start off with having a quick look at some research that we've done at OUP, looking into how stakeholders respond to the language tests that are used for admissions purposes. And really, this is part of a trend which is surprisingly recent of test providers beginning to take more interest in how the people who use their assessments think about those assessments, what they're using them for, and how they're interpreting the results. So we carried out a survey of people in universities, higher education around the world, English medium provision. We had 156 responses from different regions, so Asia Pacific, Middle East and Africa, North America, Europe, and Latin America. And they represent different groups of people who've got an interest in these issues. So academics, people in the faculty who take in students, language teachers who offer language support, assessors responsible for judging how good their English language ability is, and admissions staff who handle that side of deciding who is allowed in and who is not, and various other staff members in smaller groups as well. So we're interested in finding out more about how people are using tests, what they think should be assessed when we look at people's English language skills. So something about their needs, what they're going to require when they get into university or college. Some idea of where they think there might be gaps. So are there things that are not being assessed that should be assessed? What's the impact of the kinds of assessments that we're using? What effects do that have on how people are taught English? And what kinds of evidence of people's language skills are most valued by the people who are responsible for deciding whether or not they have the language skills needed? So some of the key findings, and these are highlighted in the white paper in various places. One is that there's strong consensus really around the world, and it didn't seem to matter which region we're talking about, on how important all skills are for academic study. So it's not a matter of reading or writing being the most important. Really, everybody agreed that all four skills, four traditional skills, are really important. And particularly the integration of skills. So it's the ability to bring together information from different modes and draw on that to integrate ideas that come from lectures, from reading, from discussion in seminars, and to put all of that together. Where there seemed to be something of a gap was in regard to writing. Perhaps traditionally, language assessments have tended to look to the essay as being the paradigm of academic writing that we try to reproduce in our tests. And actually, there seemed to be something of a corrective in our survey results, saying that sometimes short form writing, summarizing, paraphrasing seem to be more important, or at least equally important, as traditional essay writing. There also seemed to be some concern about the areas of speaking and listening, that speaking skills in particular, as realized in tests, are not interactive. So the kinds of speaking that people have to do in seminar settings or in discussion groups isn't really reflected in the kinds of tests that are being used. And a feeling that listening perhaps is not authentic, that people are, again, maybe not listening to interactive language enough in tests, and that simply relying on short extracts from lectures is not enough. As to the evidence that we accept, when we think about whether people have the skills necessary or not, people obviously have a lot of trust in tests. They think that is of all the options we gave them, they thought that was the most trustworthy form of evidence. But also locally made assessments, so assessments made by institutions themselves, and interview experiences, so actually talking to the applicants and finding out how well they could speak in English seemed to be a good source of evidence. With the impact that testing had on people's educational experience, that was considered mostly positive, that it encouraged people to study many of the right things and develop their English language skills to the level needed. But it was not unproblematic. Some people talked about a narrowing of what people were studying and a focus more on getting through the test than on thinking about how they might actually be using the language when they arrived at university. When we thought about the future, not surprisingly, perhaps AI was quite dominant, and there was a lot of discussion in people's open-ended responses about how AI might influence study through the medium of English in the future. So those are some of the key things that we found out through the survey. With regard to future directions and the way people think that English medium instruction in university settings might develop in future and how the testing of it might be improved, people talked about the introduction of more authentic and interactive scenario-based tasks that maybe AI could help us to present to test takers, that we could make the test taking experience a bit more like the university experience. More integration of skills and the use of multimodal skills. Might we want to start introducing use of images and video clips, that kind of thing, into the testing of English language skills? And a concern with how people use AI at university. So are they able to make effective use of the new tools, particularly that AI makes available to them in their university courses? And can tests in some way capture that, help us to understand whether they have the AI literacy as well as the English language skills to make best use of their time in college? So that gives you a quick flavour of what we found out from the survey. And I think this is the chance and the time now to turn it over to everyone for a wider discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. I hope we can unpack some of those threads in the time that we have remaining. As I mentioned in my opening, students today are expected to use English in far more dynamic ways, which include interacting within the classroom, engaging with digital content, and communicating in global environments. So let's pick that up first. How should we define or redefine English readiness for academic and professional success in today's global context? Michael, would you like to start us off with that?
Absolutely. For me, English readiness is a student being able to grasp concepts, whether they're verbally shared, whether they're shared in a written context, whether they're shared with a student listening to a lecture. Here at the University of New Mexico, we want our students to be able to participate in their education at a high level right away. And sometimes when our students are coming into us, they think, oh, well, I'll just be able to read the book. I won't have to pay too much attention into the lectures. Well, that might work for some faculty members in the way they teach, but in the aggregate, it doesn't work at all, because what's happening in the lectures and what's happening in the books that you may be required to read are generally two different things. And we want you to be able to have the ability to understand English in a variety of contextual settings. So that's, for me, that's a little bit of what English readiness means to me and to my university. So, and I'm sure other people have strong opinions the other way.
Thank you. Hanan, how do you approach that?
I mean, in some ways, very similar, but I think for me, I have a little bit of a problem with the term readiness, because I think it puts an emphasis on the student to be ready and no emphasis on the institution to accommodate the student. So I think there's a sort of, there's a bit missing there. It feels like it's based on a very one-way acculturation model where the student, and I think we're talking mainly about, so-called international students or so-called non-native speakers, needing to sort of fully accommodate themselves to a new context and community. Whereas for me, I do think it is, or at least should be, more of a two-way street, with institutions and communities also being sort of willing to meet students halfway, as it were. So I have a little bit of a problem with the term, but to try and answer the question, I think what students need to be able to draw on, the skill set that students need to be able to draw on now, is really complicated, as you have highlighted yourself. The skills, the language skills, are really complicated. I definitely don't think we should throw those out with the bathwater, but students now need to be able to draw on those language skills in an integrated way, as came through in the research. and to use those skills critically and collaboratively across a sort of evolving diversity of communities, texts, and contexts. And they also need to use those skills interculturally. And I think, we've been talking about intercultural competence as an important thing for students and indeed for staff for a long time. But I think that in some ways, a lot of tests, and I don't want to sort of denigrate any particular tests, and I'm not a testing expert, but my feeling is quite often that there is still a kind of, even if it's a hidden assumption, there's an assumption of a native speaker interlocutor and a sense of a non-native speaking student needing to sort of adapt to that norm. And that's miles and miles away from what students, certainly in my institution, actually need to be able to do, for example, in a seminar, which is going to be a multilingual, multimodal, really quite messy communicative experience. I think this raises an enormous challenge for test providers. I mean, how on earth do you authentically assess that? Don't have the answer to that, but I think that readiness is a bit of a problematic term, but taking it as a shorthand, I think it's increasingly complex and increasingly challenging for both institutions and students to navigate, particularly with AI as well, and the sort of inclusion of AI as potentially another voice that you include or don't include or interact with or don't interact with. So these are challenges for English for academic purposes, learning and teaching, as well as for test provision, and very difficult challenges to meet.
Thank you so much for that. I think that intercultural aspect is definitely worth exploring, particularly as English itself evolves as a global language. Thank you. Hannah, would you like to build on that? And perhaps any particular practical examples worth highlighting of real-world language skills students need in the classroom today?
Thank you. And yes, I mean, if you look at the new companion volume for the CFR, there was a whole section on mediation. And mediation, that was one. Mediation is about how you mediate between two people so that they can understand each other. That involves language proficiency. It also involves negotiation of meaning, so the use of your cognitive abilities as well. And also in the new companion volume of the CFR, there's another part which is about plurilingualism and pluricultural competence that I think now in the language testing field, people have been talking about culturally responsive assessment. And Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, that has been going on since 2009, I think, the term culturally. Yes, culturally responsive assessment. And this is about looking at the various cultures and getting topics from various cultures so that we are all now becoming citizen of a global world. So how can you bring that into the assessment field?
Thank you. Speaking of skills priorities, one interesting finding from the survey, as Tony highlighted, is that integrated skills came out as a priority area. And that's quite significant because language skills are often assessed as discrete components, even though they are rarely used in isolation. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. How well do tests currently capture that kind of interactive real-world communication, and where do you see any room for change or improvement? Michael, could I come to you on that first?
Sure. I think the testing services as a whole are trying to do a better job at it. I think the problem is there's no one great answer that any testing service can use to gauge how well that is going on in a very short time frame, right? I think we really don't know how well a student will take in that integration and be able to use that until we have long conversations and spend times with each of those students. My university, we're an R1 research university, which is one of the top tier research university levels in the United States. So when we're interviewing graduate students to come into our university, we just don't accept, okay, you have this score, fantastic. You meet the minimum requirements, that's great, you can apply. But that doesn't mean you get admitted to the university. There's an interview process. There's some of our departments require portfolios, writing samples, all those things. So preparing for those type of events just through a test is tricky at best. I think to get a full sense, we would have to have like a 3 day long test, right? And I certainly don't want to sit through that. And I know students don't want to sit through that. So I think as we start using different modalities to test students, I think it's going to improve. And I think everybody wants it to improve. It's just a slow incremental improvement that we're seeing right now.
Thank you. Hanan, drawing from something you have said previously, which is that we really cannot separate language from what happens in the real world. Do you mind elaborating on that thread?
Sure. And that relates to integrated skills. So what happens in real world? We read and then we take what we read into, we either paraphrase it or summarize it, and that's within an academic context. Even in a personal context, I may need to write notes on a poem that I read or something to remind myself of it. So it's reading into writing as well as listening into speaking. So if we want to mimic real life and authenticity, it is the integrated route. Now, the dilemma that any language testing provider would face is, well, does that give us murky grounds, or it would sort of sully the ground for one skill instead of the other? If I'm not proficient in reading, would that affect the writing? And this is why some language testing providers would go down the route of modular, so that they say the score is as pure as it can possibly be. There are no biases whatsoever. So it is a balance. Do we go authentic, integrated, or do we go modular? And since everybody has a jagged profile, you can have the modular, and the modular also might be shorter than the integrated. Yeah, maybe.
Thank you. Hannah, please go ahead.
I'm just reflecting on what you said, Hanan, and this sort of challenge that authenticity poses for test development, essentially. It'd be interesting to hear what Tony thinks, but I don't think this is a new problem in a sense, like that sort of tension between the reliability, or you said purity, of the score and the authenticity of the task. And I think even if we look at the test that dominates most of the UK market, where you have a 250-word essay, this is it's not an authentic task, but it's being used as a proxy for, say, a source-based piece of writing. So this sort of conundrum of how do we make sure that these proxy tasks are going to effectively predict successful performance on program is actually not a new problem. It's just being kind of offered to us in a different way. And I think for me, what we don't have enough of, as I don't think, is peer-reviewed research that tells us about the predictive validity of those proxy tasks. I'm quite often sort of shown research from test providers. I'm not going to name any test providers in this, but sometimes I look at research that sort of shows, oh no, this task it absolutely is a good predictor of being able to participate in this authentic academic context. And I feel like sometimes you'd need a PhD in statistics to be able to critique what is shared with us. And it's often research that has been funded by the test provider as well, which is understandable, but I'd love to see more peer-reviewed independent research that was clear and accessible, so that with the role that I have in the institution, where I advise the University of Edinburgh on which tests to accept, that would really help, all of us, just to be able to have a sort of clear evidence base for what tasks truly are truly predictive of success in authentic contexts.
Thank you. I think, Tony, this would be a good time to bring you
I
into the
think I'm being
conversation.
called up by that one, aren't I? Yes. A clear and unequivocal response on the predictive validity of any of the tests used as English language measures is that there's very little predictive validity. They don't predict particularly strongly how well somebody will perform when they get into university. That's not very surprising because other measures of cognitive abilities like A levels, for example, have even worse predictive validity of how well someone will do when they get into university. That's partly because the people who get into university have passed the test. And actually, hopefully, they all then have a good chance of success when they get there. So it would be disappointing if getting a slightly higher IELTS score gave you a much better chance of success at university, because really, if you've met the requirement, anybody who meets the requirement should have a reasonable chance of success. So looking to predictive validity maybe is not a productive route to go down. I think I'd look at it more from the sort of perspective Michael was talking about, where if we are encouraging people to do the sorts of things they need to do in university in preparing for the tests that they're going to take, that will get them some distance towards understanding kind of the challenges involved, both linguistic challenges and the intercultural challenges. So if we could have tests that sort of represent that to them in a useful way, then I think they'll build a better understanding of what they need to know and how they need to interact with people when they arrive there. I did research myself on IELTS many years ago, looking at the writing tests particularly. And as you say, a 250-word essay is not actually what people have to write when they get to university. And I think we could do a good deal more in helping them to understand that it's not what they need to do when they get to university. And there's a big gap between those things, and that achieving a certain score on IELTS doesn't mean that you now know everything that you need to know in order to operate successfully in a university setting. And much the point that you were making earlier about the messiness of it all when you get there, and the intercultural exchange and the ways in which people interact is not at all like a test situation, which is necessarily delivered in a couple of hours at best, and cannot represent everything that's required of a student and everything that's required of a university. I think the best we can hope for is it will reveal some of the gaps between what the university is offering and what the student is bringing, and suggest ways in which both the university and the student can take action to try and bridge some of those gaps. But predictive validity is not going to help us.
Speaking more about that gap, and that's something that stood out in the survey, you highlighted it in the presentation, and we have described it in the white paper also as a perceived authenticity gap between what current assessments measure and what institutions view as adequately assessed. If I could stay with you for a minute, Tony, do you find that surprising? And what do you think might be contributing to this authenticity gap?
I don't really find it very surprising. I think there are a couple of things happening. One is that the world of higher education is changing rapidly, especially as new tools come in, new ways of delivering content, new ways of interacting with content, traditional sort of attend a lecture, read a book, write an essay, that academic cycle is disrupted in some ways. And there are many new ways of accessing academic material that are not reflected in tests that have been around for many years. And I think generally a recognition that the way we do testing is quite conservative. And it is, I think Hannah made the excellent point before about it's directed towards the readiness of the student, where it should probably be directed more towards the readiness of the interaction between the student and the institution. And what are things that institutions need to know? And can we provide assessment information that guides them as much as it does the student in the nature of the gap that needs to be bridged? So, no, I think there's lots of scope for very new approaches to assessment that better reflect the changing nature of higher education.
Thank you. I imagine we cannot have this conversation without acknowledging the influence that technology has on modes of communication and in turn language. Also considering the ongoing digital transformation within higher education, digital tools are now ubiquitous within and outside of the classroom. So, how do they influence what kind of language skills we should be assessing in students, as Tony touched on? Hannah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have thoughts. I don't think I have an answer. I think it's really challenging. I think as a sector, our sort of understanding and positions on what is, what's happening with technology, how are we interacting with technology, is so evolving and dynamic that it'd be really difficult to sort of think of that in terms of a test construct. So yeah, I don't have a particular answer to that. I think that we've seen quite recently, sort of relatively speaking, a lot of digital innovation in testing, some of which I find really, really welcome. Other elements of, I sometimes feel it's like there's a tendency, or at least there's a danger of test development being driven by digital functionality. It's like, oh, well, the AI can do this, so let's do it, rather than thinking carefully about the construct. I worry about that. But I probably don't have a lot to add on that topic.
Thank you. Of course, focusing on that AI element, which is itself evolving very quickly. So, looking towards the future a little bit, how do you think AI might influence future definitions of language proficiency? I know that's a kind of a tricky question, but who would like to come in on that? Yes, Hanan, go ahead, and then I'll come to Michael.
Sure. Okay. So I think what we're seeing in real life is that we already interact with chatbots. So having a test that has a combination of AI and human interaction would be the way to go. I mean, this mirrors life. But then the other side of it is about AI literacy and actually taking on the responsibility of tutoring students on how to use AI responsibly. So, for example, if I'm being asked to summarize a reading text, I can do two things. I can put the text into any of the OpenAI sources, and it will do the summary for me. But what do I get out of this? One, what I get out of this, positive things that I can do it quickly, but it may impact my reading ability because I'm not using my inferencing skills, or I'm not using my synthesizing or evaluation skills. On the other hand, what I can do with that, if I can teach the students to do it, is that, okay, guys, so you want to use OpenAI, so summarize without the AI tool, and then compare your summary to AI. This way, I'm having them use both the comparison and the skills that I want to elicit, which is inferencing, synthesizing, and evaluating information. So I think for assessment, it would be AI interaction plus human interaction.
Thank you, Hanan. Michael, would you like to add to that?
I tend to agree with Hanan on a big chunk of this. I'm not so much worried about AI in the testing world because I think there's enough folks out there in the testing world that understand how AI can be used and how it probably shouldn't be used in the testing world, at least through my rose-colored glasses. That's what I'm hoping, right? I think once a student gets to university, gets to their educational, goal wherever they're at, I think then the use of AI needs to be coached for these students. And you need to know when to use it, when not to use it. And using AI in a research paper, having it write the paper is completely different than having the AI help you with the research and guiding you towards, um, research titles that you can look at and that you could use to craft your document. Um, we all know when somebody sends us an AI written email, right? It may be only 2 or 3 lines long, but you can spot those telltale markers. And I think students are just assuming that using AI is acceptable across the board. And truly it is not. And just being able to coach the student on when and when not to use it is up to us at the university level to make sure those students understand that. And we here at my university, again, we're a research university. They get 2 or 3 lectures on this prior to classes even starting. And then there's reminders in the syllabi and all kinds of different places for them on coaching the proper practices for using AI. And that, like I said, is completely up to us, and universities need to demand that, but they also need to be able to give the students the tools and the resources they need to be successful without using it.
Thank you. Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I really agree with what you were saying, Michael, and about the responsibility of the institution to help students develop skills for responsible and ethical interaction with AI. I don't know if I think that sort of AI literacies are part of language proficiency, or if they will in the future become part of language proficiency and something that we would even consider testing. But I think it's certainly the case that I think anyone working in the sector would recognize that there's at the very least a debate, if not a massive issue, with students kind of not working with AI in what people would consider an appropriate way. And for me, I think one of the reasons that happens is because there's this sort of conceptual separation between knowledge and language, and the idea that, like, oh well, you've got your ideas, you can get your ideas and those are your ideas, and then you can just use AI to communicate your ideas. It's a very linear and non-authentic understanding of how knowledge production works. It's much more iterative. It's reading a bit, writing a bit, thinking a bit. It goes round and round. And I don't think there's definitely no role for AI in that process, but it can't be just, oh, you have your idea and then you get AI to help you with your plan, for example. And it's like, well, that process of writing your plan is part of how you're developing your stance and your idea, and you've outsourced your kind of cognitive development. I think that is a term, cognitive offloading. So I think there's a huge amount of work that the institutions can be doing to sort of help students navigate that in a critical and mindful way. And it goes well beyond testing, but it's really important that we do that.
Thank you. Tony, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it comes to a bigger question about what universities are for and what education is for, and whether we are concerned with setting up barriers to keep people out who are somehow not deserving of the education we can offer, or whether we're about overcoming barriers and helping as many people as possible to achieve what they want to be able to achieve. I think if we're setting up barriers and we're using assessments to keep people out of our institutions because they're not good enough, then we are setting them up to cheat the system, whether that's running to the AI and asking the AI to help them get into the institution they want to get into, or to satisfy their tutors when they get there, or whether it's about cheating the system by finding ways of gaming the tests and sort of narrowly finding ways to trick the test into believing that they've got the language abilities needed to get into the prestige universities. I think that the way we set up education can encourage them to behave in ways that are self-destructive. Whereas if we look at it from a different perspective and we think about trying to help people to overcome barriers, then we're likely to help them to see how to use AI productively to help them to develop the ideas and the concepts and the language skills as well that they need in order to interact appropriately with people around them.
Thank you. I think while we're on the AI thread, there's a question in the Q&A related to that, to what we've been speaking about. So the question is anyone aware of test scores dropping or otherwise being affected by the advent of AI? My colleagues and I are experiencing a radical drop in reading skills, as more and more students are just reading assigned texts by having AI summarize it. Hannah, is that something you have seen, and do you have any advice for addressing those issues?
Sorry, I lost my unmute button there. Thanks for your patience.
That's okay.
So I haven't seen that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist in my institution. I think what we're seeing is the opposite, which is suspiciously high scores and potential concerns that work has been written by an AI, or that there's been academic misconduct and it's very difficult to prove. The other thing, sort of negative thing that I'm seeing with AI in teaching and learning context, is the use of live translation apps in interactive classes, which really makes it really affects the engagement of not just the person who's using the app, even though obviously like there must be some validity to the fact that they say it's helping them, but really affects everybody else as well and their engagement and ability to participate.
Thank you. And thank you for all the great questions. We will come back to them in just a second. So the next point I want to come to is speaking more about how we can keep up with the wider changes in the world. What do institutions need, or what should they look for when recognizing a test? I guess I'm asking, what are the key features that a language test should have today to meet the needs of students and institutions? Hanan, could I come to you first on that, please?
Sure. Other than the obvious ones, like is it valid, is it reliable, is it fair, is it equitable, is it practical? I would be looking at whether it has incorporated AI actually, whether it is computer adaptive rather than linear, because that provides a better performances, I think. What else would I be looking at? I would be looking at whether it has integrated skills or not. For example, that will be my own personal opinion, that I would favor an integrated one rather than a modular one.
Thank you. Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, but it's from a purely selfish point of view. I want to be able to access the scores, obviously, but I want to be able to dig into how that student scores, where those scores came from, right? I want to look at what sections of the test they did better on, right? Were they a better verbal person? Were they a better listener? Were they, I want to be able to dig into those. And many of our tests that are available are allowing us to do that, some better than others. But that's my only personal, truly selfish goal. The rest of it we've already just talked about. We've all mentioned everything already about what we would like to see for the test. That was my one and only personal goal for most tests.
Thank you. Hannah, would you like to add to that? And a follow-up question I would like to add on to the initial question is, do you see any challenges, or what challenges do institutions commonly face in trying to perhaps strike the right balance between the strengths of standardization while also allowing for flexibility and authenticity?
So I think I kind of touched on one of the challenges earlier, which was really sort of, and it sounds like it's a bit of a wild goose chase, but chasing predictive validity and really wanting to be sure that there's some sort of evidence that success on the test will predict success on program. But the main things in my institution, the things that we're looking for are the most important thing for us is authenticity, and do we feel that it is an authentic test of academic English? Well, understanding that the tasks will be a proxy, but that's really one of the main things that we're looking for. We also do we want to look at mapping to the CEFR, because that's actually a requirement in the UK for visa, that it must be at CEFR B2 or above. So we need to be able to map and make sure that that's truly the case. That's quite often already being done by the test provider. I'm not necessarily saying we're going to do it ourselves, but that's a key thing that we have to look at, is it's a visa compliance issue. Other things that we look at in terms of balancing is we're keen that there are different options for different student circumstances. So we recently started accepting the occupational English test, for example, because that's particularly relevant to students who are going to be studying in healthcare settings. We accept some digital tests for accessibility reasons, although not all digital tests are necessarily accessible. And then we also have a sort of bespoke partnership with a particular test provider, because they are able to work with us to reach applicants in particularly difficult circumstances. For example, applicants who are displaced or geopolitical reasons, they maybe can't access a test centre or access a different type of test. And we did some work with that test provider on trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed testing, to try and make sure that the experience for those applicants, many of whom had recent really horrible traumatic experiences, just sort of making sure that the test content is suitable for them and that the experience is quite humanized. And sadly, with what's going on in the world, we're probably going to see more and more demand for that type of service as well.
Thank you. I think I would like to dwell on that point.
Oh, sorry, can I add just one more thing that's really, really important before you dwell on that point? Is something that we always look at is just accessibility as well, for in terms of disability, neuro inclusion, those types of things. So they're quite key things, but we do have a list. It's in our English language policy as well. You can see the things that we look for.
Thank you. Hanan, please go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, so there are lots of English language test providers around, yeah? And for me to choose one of them, I would want to see if they are accredited by an independent quality assurance body, whatever that body is, because the independent one will look at their processes, not just the quality of the test, but it would look at the processes of marking, of standardization, of the alignment to the CFR, lots of different requirements. So that would be something else. What kind of a quality mark they have on their tests.
Thank you. Tony, circling back to the point that Hannah was making earlier, I wanted to touch on the effect of anxiety and stress associated with testing conditions itself. For some students, high stakes tests can create so much pressure that it ends up undermining learning and performance for those test takers. What steps can test providers and institutions take to mitigate that?
I think the most important one is to look at a wider range of evidence about the individual than just a test score. It's something that test providers have been calling for a long time, but for various reasons, institutions sometimes find it very difficult to look beyond that single number. But I think the more sources of evidence you have, and in our survey we found people interviewing the candidates, looking at sort of internal evidence from maybe English classes they'd taken, or looking at internal assessments of their English language ability as well as the test score. I think the more you can spread out that evidence and look at a wider picture of who that person is and how they would fit into your program, I think that then reduces the amount of stress that you're putting on them with that one number that comes from the standardized test score. And that can help. I think there are probably things that people around them can do as well, sort of in the English language education business, to help them feel less stressed about what the test is asking them to do, and not to put so much emphasis on passing tests, and to think more about just developing the abilities they need in order to be able to succeed in higher education. But it's a tricky one. Tests are stressful, and some people get affected more than others. It's definitely an intractable issue.
Thank you. Hanan, please go ahead.
I think as human beings, we get anxious of what we do not know. Yeah. And I think if we provide more information to them, and I think most testing providers would do that, it's like more information about the test, about the type of tasks that are there, giving them, I don't know, like familiarity, raising awareness or familiarity workshops of what the test would look like. So it's not, I'm not talking about teaching to the test, but actually knowing what it would, what does it involve? What would the seating arrangement look like? Even images, etc. So whatever information that can be provided would be good for the test taker.
Thank you. I think we will pause there and take some questions from the audience. The first question I would like us to address is, in many places, students often learn English mainly to pass exams. How can language assessments be designed in a way that encourages genuine communication instead of memorized answers? I think it touches on some of the points that we mentioned, Tony mentioned in the presentation, like impact of tests and washback. And so, are there any approaches or practices that you have seen that can lead to more positive impact for learners rather than just their test performance? Yes, Tony, please.
Yeah, I think Hanan touched on some of that in her last response as well. It's partly about sharing of information. So it's partly about helping language learners to understand why the test is the way it is and what it's trying to assess. So it's not about setting up, or hopefully it's not about setting up these barriers as things that students need to overcome by any means possible. So getting through the test is the measure of success. No, the measure of success is learning about the academic subject in university through the medium of English. And if they understand how the test is representing that to them imperfectly, and that there are many other things they also need to learn as well, then I think that helps to soften the impact of the test in terms of, I have to get through this test and then everything will be fine. But I think it also is part of this wider issue of tests becoming barriers to keep people out. And if we're setting up barriers to keep people out, they will look for means to get through those barriers. And if that means that the test becomes the focus of all their efforts instead of what should be the focus of their efforts, then that's perhaps not that surprising.
Thank you. The next question we have is, at my institution, students feel hesitation to speak English, and mostly they face pronunciation problems while speaking, and listening is poor. How can we involve students actively? I can see, Michael, that you have already responded in the chat, but would you like to elaborate on that?
I do. Pronunciation is, in my opinion, is the last thing students should worry about. I firmly believe that students need to learn listening for context, and they need to be able to reply verbally to that context. Does that English have to be perfect? Absolutely not. Do you have to be embarrassed that your English is perfect? Absolutely not. I am 58 years old. I've lived in the United States all my entire life, and my English on a good day is probably nearly crap to a little bit better, right? Different parts of the world pronounce words differently, and pronunciation is not anything that I worry about. Good way to overcome that, and I do this with some of my incoming students and with partners around the world, is we get together on Zooms and we talk to incoming students and just talk about everyday life kind of things, and we work on conversational English. That's what we do. It helps everybody kind of calm down, feel a little bit centered. And if you pronounce aluminum differently than I pronounce aluminum, cool, good for you. That's the way it is. That's my humble opinion. Others may have different.
Thank you, Michael. Hannah, please.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about what we mean by pronunciation, because what's important is intelligibility, and often intelligibility in a multicultural, multilingual context where many highly proficient students, as well as all sorts of different types of so-called non-native speakers, people that consider themselves as native speakers or English as first language speakers, but they're perhaps from a post-colonial context. There's so many different varieties of English, and the important thing is intelligibility rather than a particular standard of so-called correct pronunciation. So it's kind of saying what Michael said, but in a slightly different way. I do think that it's worth teaching pronunciation, though. I think that I'm a little bit maybe almost old-fashioned in that. I think that it doesn't get taught in EAP classrooms quite as much as maybe it could be taught, but through that lens of mutual and international and intercultural intelligibility rather than conforming to a standard. I also think, going back to the question that was in the chat, it may be that the word hesitation was used, and a lot of it may be about confidence building and practice, and just making sure that there's a safe and inclusive space to make a mistake or to be misunderstood and to work that out together.
Thank you.
I just want to say that about pronunciation, that for me, it only becomes important when it is unintelligible.
Exactly.
So that's it. Yeah, that's when it becomes really important. It's like it's not every single second you'll say, "Pardon, excuse me, could you repeat that again?" Then when it's a breakdown of communication, then pronunciation becomes important.
Exactly.
But it's not the be all and the end all.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost out of time, so we will leave it there. Thank you so much to our panelists for contributing their insights and expertise in the white paper and for joining us today. Thanks also to everyone who is watching. If you are curious and want to read more about some of the themes we discussed today, you can find the link to the white paper in the chat. We will also share the recording of this webinar and a post-event summary article with all the participants in the coming days. Thank you once again, and goodbye.